has been Chief Executive of the Health Research Board for just over a year, I think. He's responsible for 100 million of public money spent on clinical population health services research. Perhaps to declare my interest, I had a PhD funded through the Health Research Board, which I finished in 2012. I had a research post in Trinity, previously and currently funded by the Health Research Board. So I'm really interested in finding out how the HRB prioritises its funding allocation, and perhaps I'll give you 2-3 minutes just to kick off the debate about what process the HRB goes through in funding allocation and prioritising research questions.
Okay. The answer is fairly simple at the moment. I'm not necessarily saying it's correct and fit for purpose for the next 10 or 20 years. But we've taken the approach so far. Am I loud enough?
Yeah.
We've taken the approach to define the remit in broad areas of research, as Sarah has just said, and I suppose clinical research, what we call population health research, and more recently, particularly emphasis on health services research. So those kind of 3 broad areas are essentially defining the remit. And then within that, we effectively pick foci around investing in people and training, so at student, postdoctoral and senior level, and then infrastructural stuff, support to the actual bricks and mortar and associated services. And then the third component within that, I suppose you'd call it typical project funding. In effect, we do not pick particular functional disease or specific areas. We've allowed, within the parameters I've mentioned to you there, we've allowed the system to work in the main from the bottom up. We have tinkered more recently with certain partnerships. People will be aware, for example, with the Atlantic Philanthropies and dementia. And I do see that being something that we're going to look at more over the next couple of strategic cycles. But that's essentially how it works. That's a fairly simple place to start.
When you say bottom up, what do you mean? Do you mean researchers just pick whatever topic they want?
Within those areas I mentioned, typically then it's the researchers work according to those. So they can come in and quite a broad array within those parameters I just mentioned there. So we don't typically, and I use the word typically, say if we're coming out with a call for, I don't know, renal disease, for example, like that, and then contain it that way, which you will see in some other jurisdictions, usually combined in other jurisdictions, that top-down approach with a well-stocked bottom-up investigator-driven. So that's effectively, I suppose, it, and that's a good place to start today as our broad approach.
And do you think that's been successful? Do you think that approach has matched health needs with health research?
I think it's been reasonably successful in as far as an organisation with an annual budget in the region of 40 million. I do have to say this, that we invest that's about 0.3% of our health spend in Ireland. We spend about 13 billion a year on health, and the Health Research Board budget would be about 0.3% of that. Just to put that in an international context, the UK would be about 2.4%, and an advanced R&D company like Intel or IBM would invest about 5 or 6% of their turnover in R&D. So one has to work within that constraint. I would like, ideally, to have a combination of open, investigator-driven approaches, bottom-up as I call it, and then thematically driven calls working from the top down in specific areas. That, for me, is where we should go ultimately, but we are constrained by financial parameters. Okay?
Okay. We'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Avril, you're the Head of Research and Advocacy at Deborah Ireland. It's a national charity supporting the needs of people with EB, which is a very rare skin disease, also known as extraordinary butterflies. And you're also a board member of the Medical Research Charities Group. Deborah has been quite successful in using its research to influence policy and practice change. Can you tell us about your experience of that?
Yeah, so Graham said that it was quite simple. In my world, it's probably the complete opposite. It's probably complicated and messy and challenging in many different ways. And partly that's because I'm working in an area that's very emotive. So EBD, as you said, is a rare condition. It's particularly devastating, and we do encourage the patient voice to be at the centre of everything. But of course that makes it very difficult as well. And so within Deborah Ireland, we actually have relatively little money to spend on research. but we're very precious about it, and we do various things to bring in all the stakeholders to advise on where that money should go. And also, and I think very importantly, for us it's not just about where the money goes, it's where our time goes as well. Because we believe very strongly that there are so many things that you can do to influence the path of medicine's development that are not necessarily related to money. And I also give a lot of my time to Deborah International, which is the umbrella group for all the Deborahs around the world. There's more money there, so in a sense it gets even more complicated. And there are various things that we do to bring the patient voice through. For example, there was a priority setting partnership a couple of years ago under the James Lind Alliance model, and so we draw on that. But we bring in the researcher and clinician voices as well, and it's been actually very difficult to achieve that balance, but I think the balance is really, really important. And we've probably got better in recent times at bringing in the voice of people actually living with the condition, and that's resulted in a big change in our strategy recently, actually.
And can you just give us an example of that, of how the voices of people with EB has influenced your research?
Yeah, so we've always been very focused on therapies and cures, and anybody with any empathy would imagine that that's the thing, that's where you put your money. On the gene therapies and the cell therapies that are going to ultimately result in a big impact on a patient's life. When we bring the patient voice into it, actually what we learned was that they say, yes, that is really important to us and we want you to keep doing that, but in the meantime, could you please address this sort of symptom relief side of things? Because they're realists and they're living with this desperate condition and they want to see a difference for their children now. And so we've had this big shift in putting not all the money but a lot of our money towards more symptom relief, like itch, pain, things like that.
Okay, that's great. Deborah, I'll come back to you. I'm going to skip James for a moment and go to Richard. And Richard's head of research in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, who apparently when the research was being done for this seminar, everybody said, go to Richard, that the Department of Agriculture have a fantastic track record in prioritising research questions. So we're really interested to hear from you, Richard, about the Department of Agriculture's experience of going about prioritising research.
Thanks, Sarah, and no pressure here, right?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? I don't know whether this is working or not, but can you hear me?
Is that okay?
Is that okay? Yeah, I mean, just to backtrack a bit, maybe by way of background, unlike other departments which have agencies that fund research, we in the Department of Agriculture actually do it ourselves. So the division that I head up runs 3 programs, one for primary agriculture, it's called Stimulus, one for the food processing sector, and that's the one, I suppose, that interacts significantly with the whole health space, because it's doing not only food processing, but bioactive research and research into the nutrition space and so on, and then one on forestry. So if you go back 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago, we used to just basically put out calls in a bottom-up sort of a way. We would, periodically launch a call, and it would be up to within the broad parameters of the 3 programs that I've just mentioned, and it would be up to the investigators in the various universities, because it's project-based research undertaken by the universities, the Institutes of Technology and Chagas, and it would be up to them to come forward with proposals, and we would go through the usual evaluation process, etc. We were getting a lot of criticism about that from our industry sector, who felt that that this wasn't sufficiently targeted and responding to their particular needs. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we adopted a process that we call strategic research agenda setting. And we did this, we set up committees internally, one for each of the programs, broad stakeholder groups, and out of that process, through a period of engagement, usually over a process of about 6 months, we developed 2 strategic research agendas. One was called Food Research Ireland, and then the other one was a thing called Stimulating Sustainable Agricultural Production for and Innovation.
Just a second, can everybody hear Richard? No. Okay. Can you use the mic?
Okay, can you hear me now? Is that better?
I'm not sure the mic is on.
Turn it off, I think.
Hello?
Yeah.
In future, would you shout and tell us if you can't hear or see or whatever? Okay.
So as I say, that was when that marked a transition, I suppose, in our process to moving to this agenda setting process. And we essentially, having developed these two strategic agendas, we in the calls that we put out over the last 3 or 4 years have been basing those calls on the priorities that were identified in those two strategic agendas. Now that then led to the situation more recently in the prioritisation process, the National Research Prioritisation Process, which I presume most of you or some of you will be aware of, which yielded 14 priority areas. 2 of those dealt with food, I suppose. One was called Sustainable Food Production and Processing, and the other was Food for Health. And I was given the job of basically heading up a cross-funder working group to develop a strategic agenda for those 2 areas. And that work took place over the course of last year. It resulted in this particular document here, which I've just recently been produced, recently been printed. So all of the funders who had an interest in this particular area, so ourselves, Chagas, Marine Institute, Health Research Board, Enterprise Ireland, IDA, Science Foundation Ireland, were all involved in the process of trying to come up with an agenda on which all of us could take, at least use the document or use the material that emerged to guide the content of calls going forward. And it sets out 179, I think, priority areas, and it also sets out a process by which the funding bodies might set about implementing this, because various different pieces of it are of relevance to different funders, depending on the particular space that you're active in, whether you're funding basic research or applied research or more commercially oriented research. So, I mean, I can go into some more detail about that later if you wish, but that is I suppose, the reason why I'm here in some ways, and that is the process that we use. The working group of funders basically pooled their intelligence and their knowledge, but we also made use of surveys to stakeholder groups, and also a committee that the department itself operates, which is a broad stakeholder committee, to finalise the document and come up with these priority areas.
And Richard, I'm sure we'll come back to it in more detail, but what do you think has been the key success of or what was the key to success of your prioritisation exercise?
Well, I think looking back over the last 5 years since we've been doing this particular process, I suppose from the department's perspective, what we are doing complements maybe what has been done by other funding bodies which adopt a more bottom-up approach. This is obviously going to be very targeted or quite targeted, and insofar as the 2 earlier ones that I mentioned that we had developed, which were more, I suppose, more of relevance to ourselves alone, we basically implemented those. We took the priority areas that were identified and we put them in calls, and we worked, I suppose, quite through to the process. And I think people began to realise that this is a process that we were committed to and that we weren't going to depart from. And I think initially there was some, I suppose, concern about it, as you would expect, that certain sectors might, on any particular call, be, or subsectors might be neglected. But over time, as we adopted or continued with this process, it became evident that we did eventually get around to funding various different subsectors or research relevant to the subsectors. And we were doing all this, I think, and I suppose it's important to mention, we're doing all this as well in the context of an overarching national agenda for food development, the food development of the food industry, a thing called Food Harvest 2020. It's a process that was developed a number of years ago involving all of the stakeholder groups on the development of the agri-food sector, not just the research component of it, but obviously the research is a contributor to the overall targets that have been set in that process.
Okay, thanks Richard. And last, but by no means least, we have James Williams, who many of you will be familiar with as a research professor in the ESRI, but also principal investigator on the Growing Up in Ireland strategy, and that had its genesis in the 2000 children's strategy, which recommended a children's cohort study, and we are decades, I think 50 years maybe, behind the first British cohort study, but eventually we got there, and it got in just before the bust, which is the only reason we have it, I suspect. So maybe, James, you start off by just telling us briefly, I suspect most people in the room are familiar with growing up in Ireland, but just a little bit about growing up in Ireland, and then what we're really interested in is how growing up in Ireland went through that research prioritising process.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Can everyone hear me okay, yeah? As Sarah says, what I'd like to talk about for a few moments is basically, I suppose, what growing up in Ireland is about. It's the national longitudinal study of children and young people, and obviously it's an attempt to improve our understanding collectively, nationally, of children and young people in 21st century Ireland. Broadly, the study, which is funded wholly by the government through the DCYA, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and is being carried out by researchers from the ESRI and Trinity. Broadly, what the study records, I suppose, is the wealth of information around children's lives, especially in three main outcome areas, if you like, or three main domains. The first is physical health and their physical development, which is obviously very relevant to this group. Secondly, socio-emotional or mental health, and thirdly, their educational and cognitive development. It also requires a huge amount of background classificatory information, if you like, around the characteristics of the children, of their family circumstances, the circumstances of their neighbourhood, of their communities, their schools, even the characteristics, if you like, of their school teachers. So we're able to put together really a huge amount of information on all of the participants in the studies and all of the contexts or all of the environments within which the children and the young people are living and are being brought up. It is a very large study by any one standard. We have two cohorts or two groups of children and young people. The older cohort of 8,500 were selected when the children involved were 9 years of age, and they were interviewed along with their families and carers and teachers and so forth at that stage. They were re-interviewed at 13 years of age, and we are now later this year in the autumn about to interview them again, they and their families and so on, when they're just approaching adulthood at 17 years of age, and we'll be interviewing them again when they're 20 years of age. So I mean, that's 8,500 young people, children whom we started with when they were 9, and we will have collected information on their development at 13, 17 and 20 years of age. There's a further, even larger group of just over 11,000 children who were recruited along with their families when they were 9 months of age. At that stage, I have to confess, we did collect most information from the parents rather than the children themselves, though we did involve them at 3 years of age when we re-interviewed them in cognitive testing and so forth. And we further re-interviewed them at 5 years of age. And later this year, we'll be collecting information from that cohort of children when they're 7 years old, and later on when they're 9 years of age again. So, by anyone's standards, as I say, this is a very, very large-scale study. And the size of the study allows us statistically to speak with great accuracy, if you like, about, let's say, the prevalence of health and the health characteristics and the correlates, if you like, of their health outcomes. And I think very, very importantly, what growing up in Ireland allows us to do, apart from the longitudinal piece and look at sort of developmental trajectories and so forth, I think it allows us also to look at, sort of cross-cutting research at the effects of outcomes and characteristics in one domain of the child's life, how that impacts on another. So, for example, how do health outcomes impact on educational outcomes? And if you're interested in trying to analyse risk or resilience or protective factors in any aspect of the child's life, I think that's very, very important. At the end of the day, finally, Sarah, just say at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to develop a national piece of the national research infrastructure. It's available to everyone. All of the data, all the micro data are available on an anonymised basis, obviously, to protect the privacy and confidentiality of all of the families. They're available on an anonymised basis, in various data archives. And we really would recommend and encourage as many people as possible to use the data to the full. Because, in terms of evidence-informed policy making, in terms of their use to practitioners and really to all the stakeholders, anyone with an interest in childhood, children, child development. There's a huge amount of information there.
How do you prioritise your research questions?
I suppose at each phase of the study, we undergo a substantial consultative process with all of the main stakeholders. The most important stakeholders in the history of the study have been the children themselves. And especially, say, when we started with the 9-year-olds, we had groups of children from throughout the country in sort of focus groups, and we identified with the children themselves what the main issues were for them in their everyday lives and what they saw as the issues that we should be addressing. Through that sort of network of children and these focus groups, we tested pilot questionnaires and so forth with them, and we made sure that the questions that we were asking children were of relevance to them and that they could understand that it wasn't just adults who were imposing their views and so forth on the children. So consultation with children and young people was vital and is really critically important to what we're doing. And as I said, we're just preparing at the moment for a phase with these children who started, if you like, as children at 9 years of age. We're preparing to re-interview them at 17 years of age, and we have carried out a lot of qualitative and a lot of discussion groups with 17-year-olds to identify what the issues are. We also consulted with the other stakeholder groups, the policymakers obviously, to see what are the issues, the burning issues out there in all of the various areas that we're covering. The scientific community. As I said, the study is being implemented by a group of researchers led by the ESRI in Trinity. But we're only leading a very, very, very large group of researchers from across the country, from all of the institutions, all the third-level institutions in the country. So we have panels of scientific experts, scientific advisors, and they are sort of thematically grouped, if you like. So we do have a health panel, an educational panel, a socio-emotional mental health panel, an economic status and civic participation panel. And those panels bring together experts in the various fields, and they make suggestions and so forth from the literature and from their own knowledge and from their own particular bailiwicks, if you like, their own research interests. They make suggestions as to what topics and indeed what questions, what modules and so forth should be carried out within the study. And then, of course, we have international assessors as well, and they make a lot of suggestions as to what we should be doing. So we get inputs, if you like, from a very, very large range of the stakeholders. And then, of course, the real challenge is to try to take that wealth of information and try to cut it down into a format which is acceptable to the families and to the participants. You have to understand that when we talk about sort of doing the Growing Up in Ireland study, we are getting a commitment from each of the families in the region of about 2.5 hours. Very, very intensive questionnaire survey. So we have, if you like, to make sure that the questions that we ask, that we can see a payback, if you like, be it in policy terms, in research terms, or whatever. So, some of the main criteria that we would use in terms of selecting, from the inputs which the experts and the various stakeholder groups are making to us, the main criteria would be, let's say, the policy relevance. Issues like measurability. Often you can get suggestions that you should be measuring something, but there are not really good, reliable scales, if you like, statistical scales to allow you to measure it in a sort of quantitative context such as we're adopting for Growing Up in Ireland. There's issues around acceptability. I think I'll speed up. There's issues around acceptability to the families. As I say, we're going into the families' homes. All of this work is being done in their homes, sometimes on multiple occasions, multiple visits. So even though sort of a whole visit would take about 2.5 hours, that may be split over a number of periods, a number of sessions, if you like, with the families. There's ethical issues involved here. What's ethically acceptable, and there's very rigorous ethical control practices. Research ethics committees and so forth do a great job of work for us in sort of providing very rigorous ethical control for the study. There's just simply the time that it will take for some of the topics. You know, in the questionnaires that we administer, we see them, if you like, as a piece of real estate. And if someone wants to get something on those questionnaires to build, you know, to put into this infrastructure, if you like, they have to make a very good justification, a very good reason as to why it should be in here and take up some of that time. And finally, Sarah, and then honestly finally, you know, it has to be, the topics that we're looking at have to be really longitudinal in nature. Longitudinal studies that we're talking about, like the Growing Up in Ireland study, are expensive to fund. Everyone in this room, as I said, is funding it, you know, through your taxes and so forth. So we have to make sure that what we're looking at are really the longitudinal issues rather than cross-sectional issues. There's lots of cross-sectional studies out there, so we have to make sure that what we're looking at principally is something which has a dynamic component, which, you know, does contribute to our understanding of the child's development over time.
Okay, that's great, James. Thank you. Graham, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just I was listening there. James was mostly talking about the methods by which you prioritise the questions that are asked within the study. But there's a prioritisation question further back on the timeline, which is prioritising the infrastructure, the government decision in effect to go ahead and invest in this longitudinal study, which costs whatever it costs, similar with Tilda, etc. And that's a big question. Which ones do we choose? Why, for example, at the moment do we have one for the under 5s and the over 50s? And what's happening with the middle piece? There's a whole question mark there about the central allocation of the, whatever it is, 600 or 700 million that Ireland spends on R&D from a public investment point of view.
And do you have any thoughts on how those decisions are made?
I think at the moment, and particularly as a result of the crash, the recession that we've gone through, etc., it has become quite defensive, and I don't think it is joined up enough. People retreated to their, I suppose, government areas, their particular area of interest, and the jigsaw wasn't quite connected. We had a strategy for science, technology and innovation in 2006 that, for all its faults, did connect up the pieces, and we understood which part of the jigsaw we were working in. And that became quite, I think, separated during the crash. And I know there's an effort to get that underway again. And I think if it's done properly, it will help to do that. But it needs a prioritisation mechanism.
I'm not sure if we've anybody here from government departments, but if we do, maybe they could, if they have any answer to that particular question, that would be really helpful. I'm just going to ask the panel a quick question, and then it's going to be over to you. Do we know how to get rid of that bumping in the microphone, or is it okay for people? Okay, we'll go with it. From the poll, some of you, or all of you were polled, and some of you responded. And one of the questions that came out of the poll of you was for the panel to think about, or to discuss what are our strengths. So at meetings like this, we often quickly dive into our weaknesses and what we don't do well or right in Ireland, like prioritising big research questions. So just very quickly, would each of the panel members give a strength that Ireland has in relation to health research, if you can think of anything? Deborah.
Well, I think a relatively new strength for us is, of course, I'm going to go back to the patient involvement piece, and I think, well, thanks to the last forum meeting and thanks to work the IHRB are doing now, and I think all the patient organisations are very focused on it, I think we are bringing the patient voice into research more. The UK have always been ahead of us, but I think we're catching up with them at the moment, and that's very welcome.
Okay, Richard?
Yes, one strength I think we do have is that we're a bit more joined up, perhaps, than we used to be across government and across departments. Because if I look at my own department, I mean, and you know, understandably, we are very much focused on the development of the food sector and food processors and food manufacturers and exports and all of that. And of course, we still are. But certainly from the research point of view, there is an interconnectedness between what is done in that space and a recognition that, particularly with regard to research, that it touches on the whole area of nutrition and all of the various different conditions and syndromes and so on that can stem from that. And that food, you know, has that dimension to food production and food processing as well, in the whole area of functional food, food for health. So there is that joined up connection and recognition of it, I think, much more so now than there was in the past, and I think that is certainly a strength, as I would see it anyway.
Thanks, Richard. I suspect maybe some sectors might be a bit more joined up than other sectors, perhaps. But anyway, James, there's actually a Twitter question to you, which is, so I'm going to ask you that instead, which is, can we have an example of how findings from growing up in Ireland directly influenced a shift or a change in government policy or practice?
Well, I think, you know, if you like, given the audience today, I would look at, I'd say, the health area. And, you know, we have published a great deal from growing up in Ireland in the area of obesity, for example, over the last number of years. And I think that has really raised it up the sort of the agenda, the policy agenda, very, very substantially. Other areas, so I think, you know, even to be able to measure the proportion of the population of young children, you know, when we're talking about nearly a quarter of children at 3 years of age, 5 years of age, and, you know, up to 9 years, 13 and so forth, who are suffering from overweight and obesity, to be able to say that, you know, sort of rigorously with good science statistics and so forth running behind it, I think is very, very important. And I think, you know, from the point of view of evidence-informed policy making, I think that's critically important. I think another area which is just one.
Just one for now, because for now. Graham.
Can I give another example of that, actually, from
yeah.
another area? Just occurred to me. Many people will know the TILDA study, which is the over 50s, Roseanne Kenny and co. And for example, an example of a finding from that, I don't think it's found its way yet to the policy point, but it's a finding that requires one, and I think is being a lot of attention paid to it. I think it's a third of the over 55s, I think it was, in their sample with undiagnosed heart failure. A further third of that sample have diagnosed heart failure but on the wrong treatment, and a third have it diagnosed and on the correct treatment. So 2/3 of people with heart failure are not being managed properly. Sorry?
Blood pressure, no.
I thought it was the point being there's an implementation mechanism now required in response to that finding, which if you get in early and treat it properly, you save a lot of cost, hassle, and pain for the people involved, but also for the health service.
And one of our strengths, an example of our strengths?
It's such a cliche, but it's true in this country that the fact that we're relatively small and we can connect people together when there is a will to do so is very useful. For example, and we're building out clinical research infrastructure at the moment. The capacity to pull the emerging hospital group people connected to the universities together, I think, is a promising and fruitful area for us.
Okay, so now it's over to you. You have 30 minutes at your tables. Maybe do a really brief introduction, but don't spend more than 30 seconds telling the rest of the table about yourself, because we don't want to waste the half hour with your bios. I'm sure they're fabulously interesting, but you can swap emails and find them out, okay?